Fireside Chat with a Legend. With us today, we have a man who is responsible for over 100 orphan drug approvals in some way or the other, especially the more difficult orphan drugs that need to be difficult cases that have to be presented to the FDA. He's director at Hyman, Phelps, McNamara, a founding board director of the INDOUS organization. We are so honored to have Frank's advice and support. He's adjunct faculty of neuroscience at the Rutgers University School of Medicine. He has been a chair and vice chair of the National Organization for Rare Disorders in the US and received numerous awards, including the inaugural Lifetime Achievement Award from the NORD in 2013. He's also on the board of Alliance for Regenerative Medicine, Foundation for Cell and Gene Medicine. In the recent years, he has been instrumental in getting Zolgensma approved, among many other gene therapies as well. In addition to all the professional accomplishments that make Frank a legend, as a personal and as a human, he has received the Humanitarian Award, and I know he is very approachable, humble, and never stops working hard. In fact, he is working harder and harder as despite all the Lifetime Achievement Awards already. So it's my good fortune today and a great pleasure to welcome Frank Sasinowski. Welcome, Frank.
Harsha, it's an honor to be here with you today and with all those who are joining from India and across the world. So I just want to say, you know, kind of picking up on something that Anil shared from Sanofi, that he showed that video of the MPS warriors. And I just want to say that every one of you listening can be a warrior. And I just want to point to Harsha. Harsha represents, just like each of you, a person who has had a person with a rare disease in his family. And he has dedicated then a large portion of his life to addressing the needs of those with rare diseases. And this often happens. Harsha mentioned NORD. NORD was started by a woman who describes herself best as a grandmother from Connecticut, who had 2 sons with Tourette's. And she championed the law that became the Orphan Drug Act, along with another woman named Marjorie Guthrie, who was the widow of Woody Guthrie, a famous folk singer from the 1960s who died of Huntington's. And so again, it's your individual stories, each of you being a warrior, like Harsha being a warrior, like Abby Myers being a warrior, can yield tremendous benefits. The one thing that my career has taught me is that the power of one. So the power of one person, each of you who are listening, who is mobilized, who can act, you cannot believe the power that you have, you know, when you speak out and you become a warrior, an advocate for you and the loved ones around you who are similarly affected. So thank you. It's an honor to be here. And Harsha, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Frank, for those comments. Really inspired by all the hard work that you continue to do. And you have been at the forefront of innovation in regulatory frameworks for rare diseases and orphan drugs, both at the legislative and the executive branches of the United States government for last 4 decades. It's really our good fortune to have someone like you guiding the industry, guiding the advocates, and you have worn multiple hats on both the as a patient advocate and providing voluntary service to various organizations, and you continue to do that. You were also invited by both political parties to testify to the Congress on the 21st Century Cures Law, and President Obama recognized your contributions to the President's Council for Science and Technology report on propelling innovation in drug discovery, development, and evaluation. So these are no ordinary fiats, and you refuse to be addressed with any you create an environment where young entrepreneurs like myself can approach you and benefit from your wisdom, experience, that's what, in my opinion, makes you a true legend. So it's really a pleasure to have you again. So let's start, Frank, with the early days of Orphan Drug Act. I know you were part of the US FDA in the 1980s when the Orphan Drug Act, which revolutionized the whole industry for rare diseases, was signed into law by President Ronald Reagan. Please tell us about the early days, what it meant to patients, what it meant to the industry, what it lacked.
It turns out if you looked at the history of US drug laws, there used to be a new US drug law about every 30 years. And so the last one had been in 1962. And then in 1983, when there was this new law, the Orphan Drug Act passed and signed into law by President Reagan, it turns out that everybody at FDA, and I was at FDA, everybody at FDA thought this was very exciting. They took the woman who was in charge of all drugs and biologics at FDA, Dr. Marion Finkel. They elevated her to the commissioner's office, gave her a brand new title as head of the Office of Orphan Products. And everybody thought this was going to be a great springboard, and it was going to launch this tremendous amount of innovation in developing therapies, and that this office would be besieged, by applications from companies. It didn't happen. So the deputy commissioner of FDA asked just one person, happened to be me. He said, can you investigate this and figure out what's wrong, And I did some research, met with the NIH Patent Council, met with FDA economists. I didn't know there was FDA economists because the original law said that the only way you could be an orphan drug is if you can't have a patent and there's no way that you could recover your costs of research and development in 7 years of monopoly marketing. I looked at that, came up with fixes to it, but I didn't like them. So I told them to Marion Finkel. I brought him into her office. Now you got to remember how old I am, so I brought it into her office and she picked up her rotary phone on her desk, dialed a number. She didn't tell me who. She was dialing the congressman, Henry Waxman, who was the father of the orphan drug law. And she says, Henry, we have a problem, but I think we have a solution. And she hands me the phone and says, Frank, explain to Congressman Waxman. And so I kind of explained my fixes, but the better fixes were from him. And that is, he came up with the 1984 and the 1985 amendments to the 1983 law that removed the requirement for patentability, set instead of the requirement that you could not recover your costs of R&D in 7 years of marketing, instead set a bright line test of 200,000 people in the United States. So it made it much easier. That enabled the whole system to work. What happened, though, is that the people at the FDA said, Frank, you've got your hands around this thing. Could you draft the implementing regulations? How are we supposed to implement this law? So I drafted the implementing regulations, and there were certain features that I think that weren't bad. There were certain things that I did that I think still resonate today. And for instance, what I did is I said, if industry is going to be reluctant to invest, it's got to be because there's not enough of a patient population that is actually diagnosed, that is actually seen. That is, it can't be the number of people in a population that are estimated to have a gene defect, because a lot of people, more people, might have the actual gene defect, but not yet express the phenotypic expression of the disease. So I didn't want to count them because they could not be part of how a company could research their new therapy or to market their new therapy. So I restricted the definition to only those people who are diagnosed. That makes a big difference because a lot of diseases then might not be orphan drugs if you had to include everybody who potentially, could come down with that disease. Another thing is that I said it's a snapshot. The mid-1980s were a time in which the AIDS epidemic was raging in the United States. And the very first AIDS drug, AZT, actually got designated as an orphan drug because at the time it was brought to us, there still weren't 200,000 cases of HIV in the United States. We knew that was going to change very soon. But the idea was I wanted to make sure that when people came in, it was just a snapshot of what they had at that time. So those were the early days. You mentioned other things like it was kind of funny that both the Republicans and And then the Democrats asked me to testify at the very first inaugural panel on the 21st Century Cures Act in May 2014. That was the last major law that President Obama signed in December 2016, just before he left office in January 2017. And so it was very funny, since they had a panel of 5 people, and since both the Democrats and Republicans invited me to testify, they put me in the middle because they know I can go both ways. You know, it was very good. But we should move on. I mean, I just wanted to give a little, the reason for giving a historical perspective, because as places like India begin your program, you should take advantage of all the learnings that we have from elsewhere. This was the start globally. And in fact, when Ferdinand Sauer set up the EMA in January 1996, he invited me to be over there in early February 1996 to help them learn what they should copy and what they should avoid. So I think in the same way, the only reason for sharing history is that we learn from history, so that the past is prologue and we can use it as to help us in developing new programs.
Absolutely, Frank. Thanks for sharing that. And as we recognize across the world, policy is a piece of paper until it's really put in action. And you were instrumental in being at the FDA at the time after it was signed, and how to really operationalize it and make it real. And we have a national policy for rare disease in India that was introduced first in 2017, and now again amended and released again this year. And so we recognize that hard work lies ahead of us. This is just the beginning and not the end. And what you have demonstrated throughout your career is, in addition to being at the FDA, after you moved out of the FDA, you have led the charge, being a torch bearer, leading with the patient advocacy, and advocating for amendments to the policy in a manner that actually makes it as valuable as it could be and it should be. And I think that's the learning that we hope we can take to India and other countries as well.
Well, let me give you an example of that, Harsha. That like, for instance, 27 years after Reagan signed that law in 1983, the FDA still had not had a public hearing on orphan drugs. So I went to the 2 key senators who controlled FDA appropriations, funding for the FDA, and had Senator Brownback, the key Republican, and Senator Sherrod Brown, the key Democrat, write into their committee report authorizing FDA funds for the next year that the FDA should hold a public hearing. So when the FDA held that public hearing in June 2010, FDA knew that I was behind it, so they invited me to be the first speaker the first day. What I said to the FDA is that it's been 27 years, you've never come out with a policy statement. Those of us who are helping people with rare diseases need to know what your policies are. We need to know how much safety, how much efficacy, how much patient benefit data do we need? It's very hard to do rare disease studies. So how are you going to modify the rules that apply to therapies for prevalent diseases when you're going to be looking at the amount of information necessary for you to approve and give market access to a rare disease therapy? And the FDA said, Frank, that's too difficult. We don't know how to do that. And what I said to them is, then at least catalog. Can you provide a catalog of all your approvals so that at least we'll know what you've done? And they said, that's a great idea, but we can't do it. So I did it. So I spent the summer of 2011 then looking at the 365 new molecular entities that FDA had approved between 1983 and 2010. And I published it in a seminal paper. And what I picked out was, because I know history, is I picked out of the 1985 regulations that the FDA had done, they had added a new phrase that demanded that the FDA would apply flexibility to its statutory standards. So when I published the paper of the 365 first approvals for orphan drugs, and I found 1/3 of them could have been approved for a prevalent disease. They met the normal standards of 2 adequate and well-controlled positive studies, but 1/3 of them showed some degree of flexibility from the FDA. And 1/3 of them were dramatic flexibility. So 2/3 of all the orphan drug approvals in my review actually were embodying what the FDA had said in 1985, that they have the legal authority and in fact the requirement to flexibly apply their statutory standards. So since I published that paper in 2012, the whole world began talking about flexibility, that in the world of orphan drugs, we should be flexible. Some people call me then Flexibility Frank, because I kind of pulled this out of the regulations and gave it a platform and made it apply. So whenever you hear in the world of orphan drugs, somebody says, you know, FDA or EMA or TGA in Australia, you should be flexible. You can think back to this 1985 regulation and my 2012 paper. Why do I say that again? I say this to illustrate to each of you who are listening the power of one. I was one person going to talk to Senator Brownback and Senator Brown. I don't know them, but I was speaking on behalf of each of you. That is empowering. I spoke to them, they listened. FDA then had a hearing. I said what I thought needed to be said. FDA said, great idea, but we can't do it. So I put it on my shoulders to do. And it's changed the world. I'm not saying that to take credit for anything. Harsha knows me. I don't care about that. What I care about is telling each of you, you hold in your hands that same power. So Harsha, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thank you, Frank. That's a great message, and that really inspires me personally. And you know, one thing that we always ask individual patients is to go and speak to their elected representatives, irrespective of which country they live in. If it's a democracy, they got to go and talk to their elected representatives. And both United States and India are democracies. And that's something we want to see happen because it's powerful. The legislators need to listen to these individual patient stories. What is the journey they went through to get a diagnosis? What's the journey they are going through to even access a treatment, which may be approved elsewhere but not available in the country, and so on. So thank you for embodying
So let me speak to that then, because you can do, I can't speak to India and what legislation you might have there, but just last month, meaning November, since we just started December, just last month, there was a new piece of legislation called the Cures 2.0 bill or law. You know, it hopes to become a law someday. It's the kind of the follow-up to that law I just mentioned that President Obama signed in December 2016. So one of the provisions of this would create a rare disease center of excellence, because there is no place within the FDA that really understands and cares about patients. There is this Office of Orphan Products Development in the Commissioner's Office, but that's really responsible for looking at designations, not the amount of data, not how you run trials, not how much data you need to get approval. And so we need one place, because my experience teaches me that when I, as an advocate, and I'll use Anil's phrase and those powerful brother and sister phrase, when I'm a warrior for you, you know, I can achieve, you know, certain changes on a certain drug therapy. So I help a company get a new drug therapy approved by teaching the FDA people in that review division how this is more difficult for a rare disease and why this amount of data should satisfy their legal requirements. But then when I go to take up the next one, I have to start all over again because I'm in a different review division. So it really creates a tremendous amount of inconsistency and a tremendous educational burden to have to re-educate people every time you come in with every new therapy. And so to have a rare disease center of excellence, one place within inside the FDA that everyone could go to, you know, that would be a remarkable achievement. And so I first called for this in a public statement in September 2018 at the EveryLife Foundation for Rare Diseases annual scientific meeting. And the head of the FDA Center for Drugs at the time, and today's acting commissioner, Janet Woodcock, who is a wonderful person, a great public health advocate, couldn't say enough about her. that she said, Frank, it's a little, I think it's a little premature. You know, we're getting ahead of ourselves. Maybe it's not ready time for that. Let's try some other things first. And she's tried some other things. I don't think they've really worked. So I think we need to have, so Harsha, you asked about how each of us can be an advocate, how each of us can work with our legislatures, like India is a democracy, we're a democracy, and here in the United States. And so how each of us then can be advocates. What I'm saying is that in India, whatever piece of legislation you can be an advocate for, do it. In the United States, there's a new piece of legislation. Advocate for that. Contact your senators, your representatives in the House of Representatives, and urge them to support the Cures 2.0 bill, because it's really going to help. So I'm glad you brought up our democracies.
Thank you for sharing that, Frank. Can you tell us a little bit about what Cures 2.0 law means to patients? Why is it important? The key hallmarks of that.
Yeah. So there are other provisions in that bill, you know, that are also really important. I just wanted to highlight that as an illustration of what can be accomplished. I guess what I'm also saying is that the concept of rare diseases and orphan drugs, since you had a policy, your first one was 2017 in India, it's relatively new, so it's still evolving. I'm telling you, I've been working at this since 1983, and to me, there's still so much to do.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm saying, even when Harsha's hair turns as gray as mine, he's still going to have a lot to do in India. So
great point. Great reminder, Frank. Yeah, there's miles to go before we sleep. There's miles to go before we sleep.
Yes. Thank you, Robert Frost. Yeah.
Absolutely. So in terms of the orphan drug process, you know, having legislation and bill passed in the Congress is one thing, and then working through with the executive branch on an ongoing basis. What type of process, how flexible has FDA been? What is their expectation in terms of what evidence is expected for receiving an orphan designation or getting orphan approval, with cell and gene therapies showing so much promise, especially for monogenic rare diseases, which are about 80% of all known rare diseases. There is much promise and potential, but I guess there is hurdles to pass working through with the FDA in this process. So can you shed some light on what a startup biotech company which has innovative gene therapy product, how can they go about this?
Well, you know, I'll have to say that every time I go to the FDA and I'll say to them, look, here's another example of where you have approved a drug on the basis of a similar type of data set that this company has for these patients. And the FDA will say, well, you know, it's factually different, Frank. It's not exactly the same, so we can't apply it directly. So in every case, the FDA can always be a little dismissive, because it's true that every fact pattern will be a little bit different. So we know that's true, but it's very disheartening to me. I just got a letter from the FDA to one of my sponsors telling them that you cannot use a natural history comparator unless you were looking at death. Now, it turns out there was a drug approved for progeria, that is, you know, premature aging, terrible condition, that it was approved about a year ago, it was November 2020, on the basis of a comparison of people who were on the drug to a natural history cohort, and they showed an advantage on survival, and the drug got approved on that basis. So the FDA is recognizing that sometimes you can look at the hardest endpoint possible, which is survival, and you can look at that compared to an external control. But the FDA sent a letter to another sponsor on a very rare, serious, life-threatening disease this week and said, but you can never use it for something like motor, like looking at motor milestones. You mentioned Zolgensma. Zolgensma, the drug for spinal muscular atrophy, or floppy babies, babies who are born who will never be able to turn over, never raise their head, and they'll exist like that for 12 to 18 months with type 1 SMA until they succumb. And terrible, disease. And I remember at the Vatican showing a video of little Matteo, who had gotten the drug from Avexis when he was an infant, and showing a video of him when he's 3 years old, walking down the hall of Nationwide Children's Hospital, standing on his tiptoes, pressing the up button. In the front row was Dr. Francis Collins, the head of the NIH. Francis Collins at the NIH had cracked the human genome in 2000. He had tears in his eyes, like almost me right now, thinking about this, because he was seeing in that video of little Matteo the fruits of his labor to crack the human genome code. You're talking about all these monogenic, diseases. And if you can correct that gene defect, that single gene defect, that's what monogenic means, then you might be able to achieve normality, kind of not ameliorate the condition, but cure the condition. And that's the hope. And so what people can do is to gather, that was approved on the basis of a comparison to a natural history cohort, which said that no type 1 SMA baby would ever be able to sit unassisted for 30 seconds. And we showed them with the infants who got the Zolgensma, the gene therapy from Avexis, that they could sit, for 30 seconds unassisted. And so here was a case in which the FDA approved a drug on the basis of a comparison to natural history when it wasn't survival. It was a motor model. Yet I got a letter this week to another sponsor in a similar case in which they said you can never do that. And so what I'm saying is the fight continues. That's why you need to be warriors, and you need, and it's very important for patients, all patients, to try to talk to your caregiver, your physician who's treating you, see if you can volunteer to have your data go into a natural history, a registry, something where it can be warehoused, de-identified to protect privacy, but so that people can better understand the progression of rare diseases, because it's not clear, and it's not clear what is going to be the thing that's most clinically meaningful to the population of people who are affected with that condition. Right. So your participation in trying to make your data available to a larger enterprise, to be able to further the understanding of everyone about people with your condition, is vital to help advance the field. Yeah.
So in this regard, how do we deal with the unavailable or missing data, Frank? What I mean by that is, in rare diseases, particularly outside of United States and Europe, prevalence, the epidemiology of the disease is not well understood. The ability to diagnose rare diseases is not there as an ecosystem. India, for example, the policy recognized only about 450 or so rare diseases that have been reported officially.
Instead of 7,000, right.
Yeah. And so that's how do we deal with, if we were to get sponsors to say they are committed to diversifying globally, engage patients on a global scale, they don't have the data necessary to submit to the FDA. So is FDA flexible in accepting lack of, no reported diagnosis?
I think you're making a very good point, Harsha, because the case I'm just talking about is a case in which the FDA said, we can't really trust your natural history because we don't know that you have found everybody in the world who has had access to your investigational therapy. And we don't know that you are reporting everybody who's been untreated who has your condition. So the more we can encourage globally that people report, these cases, the better you can be connected. I think everybody with a rare disease should try to find that community. There's almost every rare disease, and I've dealt with a lot of very small ones. And I'm on the board of a group that you didn't mention called the N. Lorem Foundation. And it's to deal with people who have such a rare condition that there's probably fewer than 10 people in the world with the condition. And how do we meet their needs? So I'm on the board of that organization. So getting globally, getting information. So every patient, who has a rare disease, should try to tie into your patient organization. It's probably the easiest thing to do with the internet. There probably is a rare disease, but the other is that every company, should also be looking to be able to go beyond borders. I mean, this is something that, we were talking about. Your earlier panel said two things that were pertinent. One person said, these tests to diagnose my MPS was very expensive. So even to get diagnosed can be very difficult. That's the diagnostic odyssey. But then the other is, your person from Bridge Bio, talked about how even though he's an advocate within the company, it's difficult to persuade a company to look beyond their borders. So I think we need to all be as persistent and articulate in presenting our stories. When I say articulate, I don't mean that you know how to speak well, because sometimes the most powerful testimony to the FDA are people's heartfelt stories, no matter how they are conveyed. And the same thing talking to legislators. So you don't have to be, a gifted speaker to have a powerful story. So I just want everybody to tie into your systems, make your story available, participate, see if you can get your data into a bigger data set. Is that what you were talking about, Harsha? I'm not sure.
Yes, absolutely, Frank. Those are some of the things. And also, you mentioned about the Center of Excellence for Rare Disease at the FDA. As I have worked for FDA as a consultant for a year as well, and familiar, I've walked the campus. There is this Office of Orphan Product Development, and there is patient listening sessions. There is patient-focused drug development. FDA has recently set up patient affairs, particularly focused around rare diseases. And there is no limitation or restriction that's only for Americans. Patients anywhere in the world can have their voices heard in these sessions. So how does the Center of Excellence bring these together, or how does that change?
Well, if we had a Center for Excellence, that they would be one central warehouse. I mean, there was the National Organization for Rare Disorders, NORD, would have an annual summit. And I was at the annual summit, I guess the last one before COVID. So it would have been fall 2019. And we had two different FDA officials stand up on 2 different days. It's a 2-day summit, each of them saying, here is where everybody who has a rare disease should come to within the FDA. And they pointed to 2 different places. They gave conflicting messages. I mean, that's a perfect illustration of how there is no home for us today inside the FDA. We need a home. But getting to everybody around the globe can participate in these externally led patient-focused drug development meetings, to the listening sessions. So there are these forums, and they're very important forums, and they can be very, very, have a big impact inside the FDA. I mean, over the prior 3 days of this week, I've had 3 FDA meetings on 3 rare diseases. And I talked last night, it was last night after we had a meeting on one of these rare diseases, the top FDA physician, Dr. Billy Dunn, head of the Office of Neuroscience, which is responsible for all neurologic disorders, many of which are rare, many of which are pediatric rare diseases. He said that we need to reach beyond the little silos, the way we normally think about, fitting drugs into a certain pattern, into a certain box, because for rare diseases, they're different. Everyone is going to be different. So these kind of interactions with the FDA help to inform them. So you should look for opportunities to participate. When Billy Dunn, the person I'm talking about, really bright, really great guy, he approved very controversial approval in the spring for a new Alzheimer's drug called Adjunct. He approved that drug, and in the approval documents, he said, I know people with serious diseases who are willing, patients with those serious diseases are willing to accept a little less certainty about patient benefit because their condition is so serious. So that rather than how high of a bar we would set for a prevalent disease or one that's not as serious, in this case, not as serious a condition, that maybe we FDA should extract more certainty about how confident we are about the magnitude of treatment benefit before we prove it. But on something with a serious disease where there's an unmet medical need, never mind that's not rare, Alzheimer's is not rare, but we FDA should listen to patients, listen to what patients are saying. And he referred to a patient listening session on Alzheimer's. And he said, that's where I learned it. So these kind of interactions, and you can participate globally. You're from India, you can participate in these externally led patient-focused drug development meetings. You can zoom in, or listen.
Yeah.
So look for opportunities to have your voice heard.
Yeah,
and you can also, I'm sorry for interrupting, Harsha, but there's also written things like when the FDA comes out with a guidance document for your disease, how do you develop a drug for your disease? Like we had an externally led patient-focused drug development for a rare dermatologic condition called epidermolysis bullosa, or EB, where you have skin lesions and little girls, little children look like mummies because they're all wrapped with bandages all the time. They have to be changed, and it's very painful to change those bandages every day. And so the FDA held, at my request, happened to be, that they held an externally led patient-focused drug development, and they listened to people who had EB and their parents. And the next month, the FDA on its own initiative came out with a guidance document saying, here's what we think we heard and what companies should do and investigators develop therapies for this rare condition. Now you are in India with that rare condition. You can write to the FDA and tell the FDA what you think, so there's no limit on your participation in the process, because what it happens in the US, you might thinking, why should I pay attention? Well, it's just like when the EMA asked me to come over and help them figure out what to do with rare diseases. What goes on in the US might have ripple effects, too, for the rest of the world. Not only will it help develop a therapy that might first get approved in the US, which you might have access to in India, but also it might set the research agenda globally by what you're saying should be investigated and what kind of endpoints and which patients within that population and how long do the studies have to run, all those key determinants of trial design. So thank you for your question, Harsha. I hope it was responsive.
It was more than responsive. Thank you. Let me remind our audience listening in to send in your questions for Frank in the Q&A box. I have a couple of questions there. I will pick one of them, but continue to post your questions and we will get to them in the next few minutes. So one question from Dr. Ratna Devi is, how can industry and academia work more cohesively for creating opportunities for patient group involvement in research, design, and publications in the context of India and other countries?
Yeah, that's a great question. It turns out that, that senior FDA official I talked to last night, Billy Dunn, he mentioned patient-centered drug development, just like I heard several of the early panelists mention that. What's striking to me as an old timer is that the first US drug law was published in 1906. The word patient never appeared in a drug law until that cures law in 2016, so 110 years later. It took 110 years for somebody to recognize that the most important person for whom these therapies are being developed should have a place at the table, should have a voice, should have a role, any role. I mean, isn't that ridiculous? I mean, so it was a type of paternalism. And I have to say, since we're talking to a global community, there might be some sort of incipient, insidious colonialism in that we think just about the US or Europe or something. I mean, that also might be something that we don't speak about and we don't act consciously on, but it might be affecting our behaviors. I mean, so if we can be more global in participating, so you're saying, what can companies do? What can patients have to get them involved? You heard three companies, Sanofi, Bridge Bio, and BioMarin, all talk about how active they are at trying to involve the patient voice in their programs, and they have patient advocacy programs. And that's really encouraging. 10 years ago, that didn't exist. So we are improving. We are refining. And it's because of people like everyone who's listening to this program today, because every one of you listening is by, you say people vote with their feet. Well, you also vote with who you zoom into. Who do you give your time to? Who do you pay attention to? And so by you participating in this program today, you are affirming that you are part of this community and you're trying to advance it and mature it and grow it. And so I'm not sure how we can make everybody into like those MPS warriors, that brother and sister in India who we saw, but that's the concept, that everybody can be turned into a warrior.
Yeah. So what we have been learning in the last 3 days of this conference, Frank, listening to various perspectives coming from individual patients and patient advocates from countries like India, what patients ask for is, how can you help my child today? My child has XYZ rare disease. Doctors have told us there is little hope. And what can you do to get us treatment? Can you get us money to afford some treatments? Whether it's palliative or curative is less of a hope, unless there is a gene therapy or some sort of a program for that. So how do you explain the importance of starting wherever they are in the journey to begin by thinking about having a patient registry or a natural history study and investing their time in these types of activities, which is eventually going to help their own child or patient, but also many more patients to come.
I think the lesson, I'll go back to the first lesson I gave, which was, Abby Myers, the grandmother from Connecticut who had 2 sons with Tourette's. And, when she set out to create this new law, she probably didn't envision that all of her efforts were actually going to yield immediate benefit to her 2 sons. I mean, we're in a process, and I think the most immediate thing is to try to get into a registry so that your data immediately starts helping, and also being an advocate in your community, just raising it. It's a worn out phrase. People talk about disease awareness, but disease awareness is really important. And always, because people will write you off. I mean, I'm working on so many therapies in which there's maybe 100 people in the world known to have the condition. I mean, so when you go to somebody and say, oh, I have Barth, or something, people will say, well, I've never heard of that. And then they look it up on Wikipedia and they see not many people have it. So they're not going to be very interested. But if what you say is, I have a Barth and it's a rare disease, and there are 7,000 rare diseases, and 1 in 10 people in the United States are going to have a rare disease, which means it's almost impossible for you to name a family with its extended family and friends who is not touched by a rare disease. If you then, it's not disease awareness about Barth, about your particular one, it's disease awareness about this issue. It's a bigger societal issue, that you are part of. And that's what, and so joining up into these, in addition to your disease specific advocacy group, in addition to that, also looking for the NORDs, the EveryLife Foundation, Global Genes, these other organizations, or IndoUSrare, which are not disease specific, but are across all rare diseases. You have a lot more power. It's the idea that, as a single straw, you can easily be broken. But if you bind together a whole thousands of pieces of straw and tie them together, it's a really strong, bulwark against suffering.
Yeah. Thank you, Frank, for that response. We have another question here from Gitanjali Sehgal from Families of SMA, India. What will it take for biopharmaceutical companies to include Indian patients in clinical trials? And how do we get funding for treatments that are FDA approved, but are extremely expensive and hence not accessible for Indian patients? So
maybe the first half of her question, it's a very good question. Thank you. But the very first part might be better for, the people from Sanofi and BridgeBio and BioMarin to answer, like why aren't, kind of their inclusion of patients like with SMA in studies, in India, why aren't they opening up sites there? So I don't know whether you want to, open up the panel to these other people to address that. But it seems like they would be better positioned to be able to talk about that.
Absolutely. But Frank, you and I have discussed in the past about how for certain types of trials, patients may be able to travel for a one-time therapy and then go back to their home country and have a long-term follow-up.
Yeah. I think COVID did one good thing for us. It showed us that you can do telemedicine. And so I think that the possibility, if you're talking about like a gene therapy, like a Zolgensma, or let's say you're talking about a new, gene therapy for some other monogenic disease. And so it's still investigational. And you can be part of a trial. Maybe you can fly to the United States, be over here. There might be some period of, that you have to first go through screening. There might be some conditioning necessary with steroids to prevent, an acute reaction when you're given the gene therapy, but then the one-time gene therapy and then stay here for a little while, I don't know, a month, 2 months or so, to be able to make sure there's no subacute kind of or subchronic, kind of reactions, but then go back and you can be monitored then for your condition over in India, through telemedicine. So I think those gene therapy, and you have what's so-called one and done therapies, those probably are more amenable to having international participation by having the people, come to a site in the United States and receive their therapy and then go back and just be monitored for long-term safety and efficacy, in India. I think that's probably possible. There's a bigger problem with, Kate just mentioned, they just got approved for a drug for chondroplasia. These are not one and done. The Sanofi drugs for lysosomal storage diseases are not one and done. So those are more difficult to include.
Yeah, great point, Frank. One question I have is around the digital therapeutics and digital health. How is,
Yes.
What are you seeing within the context of rare diseases? Are digital therapeutics relevant, and how they are impacting?
I think if I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that maybe we can overcome, these problems of justice and equity, fairness, and stuff by having global participation when maybe you don't ever have to travel, so that, you can have your monitoring, through digital, have everything, all the instruments, everything done. So a local care provider, can access a person no matter where they are. Now, I think that there are some people, and I know there are lots of different institutions who are working on this. I know you're helping with Jiva and George Mason University do this. I know I'm an adjunct professor of neurology at the University of Rochester Medical School. I don't know how that happened. And I know that there are people there doing that, looking at it. So I'm very hopeful that, before the rest of you are gone, I might be gone, but before the rest of you are gone, we'll be able to evolve into a system in which we'll have that kind of digital technology that will enable us, empower us to have more just, fair, diverse populations across the globe participating in trials.
Right. There is another question, anonymous attendee asking, is there a scope for gene therapy for thalassemia to come out at affordable costs anytime soon?
Well, I am not working on a gene therapy for thalassemia, so I'm not aware. So I don't know the scope of research. I know thalassemia is one of those that people talk about. I know that there are things out there for things like sickle cell. So I know that there are efforts. I know people are talking about it at least. I don't know how advanced they are. Yeah.
Yeah. Another question from Shreyansh Srivastava from India asking, how do we make the rare disease community come out and speak up? There is a lot of stigma associated with it. Many people are not willing to talk about it. And from his own personal experience, they don't feel safe, or they feel shy or embarrassed to talk about it.
Look, I have a son who has Tourette's, and he was beaten up every day on the bus going to school. During breaks in the school day, you know, you go out to the playground and coming home on the bus every day because he was different. So anybody who has a rare disease, you know, their dream is to be normal, you know. And so, of course, it's difficult to come out. It's difficult to speak out. It's difficult, you know, to come out because you feel isolated, alone, you feel different, you feel ostracized, maybe stigmatized. It is, that's why I like what Anil said about, you know, in his video, and that's why I keep going back and using the word warrior. I've never used that word before. I'm going to start using it because you have to be a warrior. You have to almost take up that mentality. I'm a lawyer. Sometimes lawyers are called advocates. I think what we have to be in the rare disease community is fighters. We have to be more than advocates. We have to be fighters. And I think you have to be a warrior to step out. And everybody, you know, on a Myers-Briggs, I'm just an extrovert. So it's easier for me to step out. If you're by nature an introvert, it's even more difficult for you to step out and speak. So, you know, you have to do what you can do. You know, each of us is a gift, and each of us is a blessing in the family of man and woman. And so each of us have to act within where we are comfortable. But it's seeing, looking inside yourself and seeing what you can do. Look inside your community. Start small. I mean, you know, it turns out my spiritual director happens to be, I'm Catholic, so he's a Catholic priest and oblate. And it turns out one day at the rectory, I met his niece, who has 2 blind sons. And I helped Kristen Smedley then start a patient organization that's called Curing Retinal Blindness. And it's now a very vibrant organization. And it's just, that's why I say about the power of one. Don't ever minimize, you know, how much you can get done, even if it means just standing up and talking within your family and friends and standing up for your community and place yourself within the context of the bigger community of all rare diseases. Because as soon as you start talking about all rare diseases, somebody is going to say, yes, I do know somebody with a rare disease.
Yeah, great point, Frank. Just like in the Catholic, in the Hindu religion, also there is a scripture which talks about karma and duty. And for someone with a rare disease, it becomes their duty to fight for themselves. You know, having a good, happy, long life is a birthright and a duty of every individual. And so you have to do your duty. Nothing to be ashamed, embarrassed about it. You should speak up and advocate and be a fighter, like Frank said. I think most religions and spiritual scriptures have something that we can hold on to that justifies doing that.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Harsha. Yeah.
So one question, Frank, which probably we should have started with that, is the definition of a rare disease, right? Which the definition of a rare disease. We heard even in this conference from a patient advocate, why do we keep going back to the definition? It sounds like 101, you know, it's basics. Let's get past this and let's talk about treatments. You know, if we are stuck in the definition forever, what would you say to that?
Well, expand on that a little more. What are you looking for, Harsha? What is it?
Yeah, in the context of a rare disease policy, right?
Yes.
And having the incentives, the Orphan Drug Act, it has the 200,000 Americans or fewer would need to be affected for a drug to be considered orphan. And similarly, in India, that policy does not actually give a formal definition like that. And so it recognizes a groups of diseases which fall in specific categories, but it does not recognize all of those diseases. Yeah. And so having a definition becomes important so that all patients can get the benefit of that policy. So it's black and white, and there is a way to benefit from the policy itself. Otherwise, it's just a piece of paper and they don't. So yeah, in that context.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to get a number, and so the somebody just in chat said the number in India is 500,000. Is that the number? So
yeah, so that's the number that the CIDSCO adopted as a definition for a orphan drug. But in the rare disease policy, that definition has not been adopted.
And you mentioned earlier about, can we get beyond this to talk about treatments? And it turns out that in the United States, there's been more than a reluctance, an abhorrence to talk about how we should change the standards for rare diseases. And that's why I brought up, my example of flexibility. And I created this recognition that FDA has been doing the right thing. It just doesn't know it's been doing the right thing, and it doesn't articulate it. And so therefore, people developing new therapies don't have any ability to reference it because there's no there. There's no, so maybe what I heard you saying, and maybe because I want to hear it, is that we should evolve, we should transcend getting stuck just talking about the definition and talk about how do we change the standards that we need to get new therapies to patients, to make it easier to get access to therapies so that even more people as academics are drawn into the field. You heard that Kate had been at the University of Minnesota for many years. I know lots of academics who are very interested in the field. So we want to be able to enable people who want to do good research to be able to translate that basic research into actual therapies for patients so that they're even more drawn to do even better research. So maybe the next step is in this journey, you used the word journey before, Harsha. So maybe the next step in this journey is for us to get beyond just the definition and start talking about changing the standards so that we have a unique standard, because it's so much more difficult. There are so few subjects. The diseases are so much not understood. There are no instruments that have been validated to measure the impact on how a patient feels or functions with these rare diseases. You have to always start from scratch, and you're never going to be able to get the same quantum and quality of information that you would get for a prevalent disease. And that's where, at least in the US, the FDA is stuck, because they demand the same amount that you would get for a prevalent disease, and that's impossible. I'm going to put it, since you mentioned, in India, and you mentioned, in Hindu, that in your faith tradition, that I'm going to say that in every faith tradition, I cannot believe that a divine entity would somehow want us to somehow treat less equitably, less fairly, less lovingly those who happen by accident to have a rare disease rather than a prevalent disease. Just because you happen to have type 2 diabetes or hypertension, should you be able to have many, many, many medicines that you can choose from among a whole, a portfolio, a medicine cabinet full of medicines, to keep trying to find one that you will tolerate and that will actually help you? Whereas in the rare disease, if you are born, because the divine has created each of us as a beloved individual, so therefore each of us has the same inherent dignity. And so therefore, there has to be a way to be able to recognize the inherent dignity of each beloved. And therefore, the current systems don't do that, because they try to squeeze us all into the paradigm that was built for those who are lucky enough to have prevalent diseases. So
yeah,
there's further steps in the evolution of our journey. And, I happen to be lucky enough that I started with some of the first baby steps, but I'm passing it on to you who are stronger and younger to be able to carry us on further with the journey.
Yeah, great point, Frank. And we are on the top of the hour. So I will ask my final question and we will open up for networking and everyone to join in as well. As I ask this last question, Sadiq, you can let everybody in, if you have seen the evolution of Orphan Drug Act and the rare diseases, patients, advocacy, all of that since the 1980s for last 35 plus years now. If you had a magic wand, what would you do to help patients with rare diseases globally?
If I had a magic wand, I would, kind of, again, because orphan drugs started here in the United States, I would then, start right here and create a new standard for rare diseases that would allow, people to develop therapies, understanding that people with rare, serious, most often pediatric life-threatening diseases, that they have the ability to recognize that people like us, I'll say in this community, are willing to accept more risk and are willing to accept less certainty of benefit. And so therefore there should be a different standard so that we aren't forced to try to fit the standard that was built for common diseases. And I think that could be the most, if I had a magic wand, I think that could be the most transformational change that would affect everything.
Thank you so much for that response, Frank. We will all work towards achieving that flexibility and new standards that you have set in this space. So with that concludes our formal